So by now, we actually already have a basic mean app up and running. We got our Angular Frontend and we got our NodeJS Backend, which also talks to our Mongo database. So we got all the core pieces up and running and we got them connected. Now, we could end here, but that would not be the most exciting course, right? Because we only scratched the surface. There are many more features I definitely want to show you and I want to practice with you because they are important in modern applications. That includes things like authentication and better error handling, things I'll come back to later. But it also includes a little bit more work on our front end. For example, we can't edit our posts yet. We also manage all on one single page. And yes, we have a single page application, but that actually means something different. We should have different pages, just all rendered with Angular, right? So these are things we'll work on in this module before we then dive even deeper and add more and more features to the app. With the cleanup work done on the backend, there are two things I want to do on the front end now. Well, actually, it's just one thing. When we add a new post, like this one, or when we added a post, like here, I actually want to redirect the user back to the messages page once this is done. Well, and then as a bonus, I guess there is one other thing I want to do. I want to show a spinner whilst we are waiting for the posts. It's really fast, but you see there is no posts added yet, blinking up for a brief second. And also, if we edit a post, here we also have that very slight delay because our server is very fast, because it's running on our local machine. But I want to show a spinner here. So navigate the user and show a spinner. These are two things I want to add now. Navigating the user is super simple. In post create here, we actually have on save post. And what I essentially want to do is I want to navigate the user once we're done adding the post or updating the post. So I guess I actually want to do it in the post service, right? Here, when we get back the success response, this is where we want to navigate away. And we also want to navigate away here in add post. So let's add something, let's inject something into posts service, which helps us with navigation. And that's the Angular router. Because we cannot just change pages by adding links like new post, we can also do that programmatically. For that, I'll inject my router, which is of type router, and which is imported from @Angular router. So make sure to add this import here at the top, and then you can use that router in that service file. Now, how do we use it? Let's use it here in add post. Once we're done subscribing, here at the very end, I can reach out to my router and call the navigate method. And there we actually have to pass in an array of segments, just as we did it for router link when we actually wanted to pass more than a normal string. Here we always have to do it. And the first segment in this case, well, it will just be slash. I always want to go back to the root route. And I'll not just do that here in add post, but also in update post. By the way, we're replicating code here and here. I will leave it like this for now to make this really explicit. You could, of course, refactor this into a method you're calling in both places. So now we're navigating when we're adding or updating a post. We also want to have a spinner, or I want to have it, so I guess you will also want to have it in this course. Let's check the material docs, the Angular material docs real quick. There, under components, we conveniently find a spinner. Here, progress spinner. And that looks pretty good. I want to have that spinner. It's the mat progress spinner component, though we can actually use just mat spinner if we want to have an infinite spinner. So not a spinner going from 0 to 100, but a spinner which spins, well, as long as it needs to spin. To use that, we need to unlock it. So time to revisit our app module. And here, let's add a new material component or module, progress spinner module. Mat progress spinner module needs to be added to imports, and that of course means we also need to add an import to it from the add Angular material package at the top of the file. Now we can use that in our post create component when we are loading the post, for example. So here in ng on init, when we are fetching a post, we want to show it when we start fetching, so here, and we want to hide it once we got a result, so here. Even though these lines are next to each other, this code here in subscribe will execute asynchronously, so only once the response is there. Now to show that spinner here, let's add a new property, is loading, which is false initially, let's say. Here, when we start loading, we can set is loading to true. And then here, when we are done, I'll set it back to false. We can now use is loading to actually hide that entire form here and show a spinner instead as long as we are loading. We can do that by adding mat spinner here at the top. And then we can use ngIf to only show that if is loading is true. On the other hand, the form is only added if ngIf is loading is false. So if not is loading with that exclamation mark at the beginning. If we now save that and I go back to my application, let's try it out by going back to messages and editing this. And you saw that it wasn't that long, but there was that spinner. Now it wasn't centered or anything like that. We could, of course, add that styling. We could make sure it's centered. For example, by going to our CSS file, target mat spinner, and give it a margin of auto. This should center it. Yeah, well, it's really hard to see because it's so fast, but here it is. And it would also be nice to show a spinner whilst we are, well, saving the post. Even though that's fast, it takes a brief second until this is updated. So we probably want to show the spinner there too. And all we have to do that is control is loading in our post create component. So in on save post, whenever we are creating the post here, I want to start loading. So this is loading is set to true. Now I don't need to reset it to false because we will navigate away from this page anyways. And if we come back to it, well, then is loading will be set back to false. So this should be fine. Now if I load that page, I see a spinner. And if I hit save, I also see one until I'm done and we go back. Now I want to add a spinner to that message list page here, so to the post list page. We can do that in exactly the same way, of course. We can add mat spinner here above our accordion. There we got mat spinner. And I already will center it here. So target the mat spinner selector and add a margin of auto to center it. But now, of course, we need that is loading property here too. And how do we add this? Well, let's add is loading and set it to false. And then in ng on init, we essentially want to set is loading back to false, or first of all, we'll set it to true at the very beginning before we call get posts. There we will set is loading to true. But as soon as we get updated posts here, I'll set is loading back to false, because then we definitely have posts and we're done. And now with that, we of course want to use is loading together with ngIf again. So let's add ngIf is loading to the spinner, and to the accordion we'll add the opposite, ngIf not is loading. Now if we save that, let it reload, we got an error. Can't have multiple template bindings on one element. Oh yeah, we already got an ngIf on the accordion, of course. That will not work. So we only want to show the accordion if we got enough posts and if we're not loading. So and if is not loading. And the same for the paragraph, by the way. We can show that we have no posts yet, but we only want to show it if we're not loading. If we are loading, we want to show neither the accordion nor the paragraph. So now if we go back, you saw that spinner? You have to watch really good. But now there is that spinner. It's super fast, but you can see it for the fraction of a second. So now the spinner is added. Now our frontend is looking good like that. Let's move on, and in the next lecture, let's add an image upload, and of course, an image to the post thereafter. So here is our app in its current state, and as I mentioned, I want to have multiple pages up here, different parts in the app between which I can switch. For example, I want to have the main page, which simply lists the posts, but that part, that page, where we actually add a new post, so this card here, I want to outsource this to a different page. And I also then want to enable editing of the posts, so that we can connect this edit button to do something useful. So step by step, let's start by adding multiple pages here. As I said, we'll have the starting page with the posts here, and I will add one other page where we can create and edit posts. For that, we need the Angular router. Right now, we got our posts area with the post create and the post list component. Now, we could load these components on separate pages. To do that, I'll add a new module on the root level of my Angular application. Next to the app module, I will create a new file, and I will name this file app-routing.module.ts. Now, theoretically, that name is up to you, but it is a convention to name that file which manages the Angular routes like this, so the top level file which does that. So the app routing module, and in there, we will create and export a normal class. So normal class, which is named app routing module. Now, this will become an Angular module. And in case you don't know, Angular modules are basically building blocks Angular analyzes to find out which features your app uses. And we could absolutely define our routes in the normal app module. It's just a good practice to not put everything into this file, but to split our logic across multiple files and to, for example, put all the route setup, the route config into a separate file, which we then import into our main app module. So in the app routing module, I will decorate this class with the ng module decorator because it is an Angular module which we're creating here. And there I want to use another feature of the Angular package, and that other feature will be the router module. The router module is imported from @Angular router, and as the name suggests, this module helps us with routing. It actually enables the Angular router, and it's able to handle a route configuration and therefore let the Angular router do its job. Without that module, we can't use the Angular router. Now, what is the Angular router? I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to how Angular routes connect or don't connect to our backend routes. For now, let's continue with creating some routes. And what are routes to begin with? Well, routes are simply JavaScript objects here where we define for which URL which part of our app should be presented. We therefore create a new constant, maybe named routes. That name is up to you though, which is of type routes. And that type is also imported from the Angular router package. Now, this constant actually simply holds an array of JavaScript objects. And each object has to have a certain structure. It needs to have a path property. This defines for which part after our domain we want to load a certain page. And if the path is empty, as it is here, this simply means the main page, the root page, the starting page. So our domain /nothing. So in our local setting, localhost 4200 /nothing. This will load this route. So that's our path here. We then have to define what should get loaded. And here I want to load a component, which I do with the component property. And then we pass the type of the component we want to load. This means that we need to import it here. So for example, if I want to load my post list component here, my IDE helps me by automatically importing the post list component from the posts folder and there the post list folder and then from the post list component file without the extension, but make sure that you add this import. Now we got this first route defined. we can now also add a second route here, path, and this route could now be the create route. So maybe we want to create new posts with the /create path. Now important, you don't add /create here, you just add create. And now this would become active whenever we visit our domain. So in our case, localhost 4200/create. Then this route would get active. And here we can simply say that we want to load the post create component and also import that, of course. Now this is our very simple route config. We got two routes, the root route, which loads our list of components, a list of posts, and the create route, which, well, loads that create component. Now we just need to inform the Angular router module about our routes. And we do that by, first of all, importing, with the imports statement in the module, by importing the router module into this Angular module. So we add imports router module, and now here we have to call a method this module provides for root. This takes our root route config, so the routes constant we defined here. Now the Angular router is aware of our routes. Now to be able to add it to our app module, which is the main module of our app and the module with which our app gets started, we have to export this configured router module. So we add the exports array here and then router module. And now we can use this router module with our route configuration outside of this Angular module here. And we do that in the app module. Here, we simply add our router module, maybe below the browser module. Here, add the app routing module. Now my IDE again automatically added an import here, so make sure to add this import too, pointing at the app routing module file. And with that added, we can now use the Angular router with our configuration here. And we do so by marking a place where Angular should load the active routes. And for that, I'll go into my app component template. And here, right now, we always include the create and the list component above each other. Now I want to have neither, instead either of the two should be loaded through the Angular router. So I will delete the two selectors here, and instead we need to provide a hook for the Angular router where it can render its content. And this hook is created with the router outlet directive, which is provided by the Angular router package. And we can use it since we have the router module imported into our Angular module indirectly through the app routing module. So now this is enabled. If we now save this, the app should reload, hopefully without errors. Here it is. And now it reloads here too, and we are on the route list page. Now to access the part where we can create routes, we have to access localhost 4200/create. And now we still have the toolbar, because that is shared, right? It's here, part of the app component. The routing hook is then inside of the main block. So we always have the toolbar, but we swap the list of posts and our, well, post create area. Now, we are missing links to access these routes though, because right now we can manually hard code the URL, but that's not really how we want to navigate around. Instead, it would be nicer if we had links in our header. And of course, we can add such links here. In our header component, we can wrap my messages here with a span, like this. And then we can add another span where we handle, or an unordered list, where we handle our toolbar items. So here we can add an unordered list with our list items. And in that list item here, I will have an anchor tag, which will not use the normal reference, but instead the Angular router link directive. Now, this is used by the Angular router to turn this into a normal link where clicks are captured by the Angular router so that it can actually, well, stop the default behavior of sending a HTTP request and actually just re-render the page for the page we tried to visit. And here we could have a link to /create, which we simply, well, want to use to add a new post. Now, the styling will be awful, but we should be able to see that at least. Here it is. Now, as I said, the styling is awful and my messages is not connected. So we should actually go back and also wrap this in an anchor tag with router link that leads to just /nothing to load the root page. And then we can connect this too. Now, if we go back, well, both looks awful, but we can switch between these. But of course, well, we need to work on that styling. Let's do that in the next lecture. We added basic routing, but, well, as I said, we can probably improve the visuals up here. So let's work on the styling of our links. And for that, I'll add a new file to my header component, the header.component.css file. I will now go to my TypeScript definition of the header component and connect it to that CSS file with the styles URL, with the style URLs property here. This takes an array where you could add multiple style files, but I of course only want to point to that single header.component CSS file we just created. And now in there we can style our anchor tags for this component here. So let's style the anchor tags. Let's say we want to have no text decoration. Maybe the color should be white. And this looks already much better. Now, of course, that bullet point should go away. So I know that for this component, my unordered list should have a list style of none. And I also want to set the padding to 0 and the margin to 0 here. We now go back. This looks better, but now messages and new posts directly sit on, well, next to each other. And would be nice to have some spacing in there and have the new post option on the right. Because later we will also add options to, or an option to go to the sign up area, for example. And we can easily add such a thing by adding one extra element here in our toolbar, another span, which we don't give any content, but a class which could be spacer. The name is up to you, but now we can take that class and style that here in our header.css file. And the style you should assign here is flex11auto, because the toolbar uses flexbox by default, and this will actually make sure that the spacer element takes all the available remaining space between the other elements you got up there. And it therefore pushes new posts to the right and my messages to the left. And now this looks much better. Now, it would also be nice to have some styling on that last button when we hover over it, or when we actually are on that links page. And we can achieve this by not using a normal anchor tag like this, but by also adding the mat button directive to this. Now this is a material button. If we go back, you now see it looks a bit different. And now we got a nice hover effect out of the box, which is pretty neat. It's also a bit smaller than my messages, which is also great because this is our brand here on the left. This isn't. So now it would just be nice to keep some highlighted style, maybe change the color of it when we are on that create page. And to add this feature, we can go back and use another feature of the Angular router. We can add the router link active directive here, which will actually assign a new CSS class to that link whenever it detects that the route this link leads to is the currently active route. And now another cool thing is that Angular material actually has a couple of helper CSS classes you can use, like mat accent. This will apply the accent color to the underlying element. So now with that, you see it's highlighted like this if we are on the page, but if we are not, well, then it's not highlighted like this. So this is a nice effect for now. We might revisit this later, but for now we got this working. We can switch between the pages and we have a visual feedback about which page we're on. Let's now focus on this create page again, and let's make sure that we can not just create new posts with it, but also edit existing posts. Now we added routing, and before we dive into editing posts, there's one important thing I want to highlight. We now have routes here in our Angular app defined in the app routing module. But we also have routes on the backend in the app.js file. And these routes are actually not really connected. they're running on different servers. So our backend is of course running on localhost 3000 because that is the port we defined. And they do different things. The Angular router is actually just a tool that is able to parse the URL of our app and then render different things onto the screen through JavaScript. That is what it's doing. It's not loading different HTML pages. We only have one HTML page, the index.html page. But it's re-rendering the content of that page for the different URLs we're visiting. Now important, these routes here in the Angular router are only known by Angular, which is a client-side application, so which is a JavaScript-driven application running in the browser. This means, and this will become important when we later deploy this, that the server doesn't know these routes, neither our backend here, nor any server that might serve our Angular app. And I will show you which implications this has and how we make the server aware of this fact later when we deploy this. It's also important to note that if you were to host your Angular app on the same server as your Node app, there will be a couple of things to keep in mind, which you will see, but one important thing is that you must not use routes you defined in Angular, like this /create route here, that you must not use them in your backend too. Because what would happen then is that the server would parse and understand them because you defined them there, and it would not pass the page on to Angular to also have a look at that. Instead, it would do what it does, and this is probably not that it returns the index.html file. So this is very abstract. We'll come back to this when we deploy our app, but it's important to understand the difference between client-side routing, which is all about reading the URL and re-rendering parts of the page, and server-side routing, which is all about handling incoming requests and sending back something different. In one case, the server-side routing, you really exchange data, you're sending requests and responses. In the client-side case, you're not doing that. You're reading the URL and you are re-rendering the page. Now with that theory part out of the way, now that we know that there at least is some difference between server-side and client-side routing, let's actually go back to the client-side and make our posts editable. Now, right now, I can, of course, still create new posts, like here, new post. This is a new post, like that. And if I save that, I can go back to my messages, and here we got the new post. Now, clicking edit doesn't do anything, though. Now, I want to change it. When we click edit, I simply want to go back to the new post page. But of course, it shouldn't be the new post page. It should just be, well, the same form I see there, I'd say. So I will first of all create a new route for that. That new route will also load the post create component, but I will access it through edit, and then I need to know which post to edit. And that should be information that's encoded in the URL. So I will add a dynamic segment to that path. So edit is one part of the path, but then I'll have another part separated by a slash, which is dynamic, and that is indicated to the Angular router by adding a colon. And then you can name this however you want, like for example, post ID. You'll later be able to extract that dynamic information by that parameter, but you'll see how that works in a second. So now we're loading the post create component for this path too, but actually we'll then do something different. Now, the post create component is of course this component which holds our form, and we can actually reuse that form. That will probably be all right. But we have to make sure that when we hit save post, and therefore when we submit this and call on add post, that we actually differentiate between are we adding a new post or editing an existing one. But step by step, we now know that the post create component will be loaded for two different paths, and we will need to make sure that we actually handle these different cases. Thankfully, the Angular router gives us a little help with that. We can inject something into the component, which is loaded through the router, which helps us identify some route information, like for example, the exact path through which this route was loaded. And this will become important because we will know that when we can extract the post ID, that we are in edit mode, whilst in the other case that we can't extract this, we are in the create mode. So in the post create component, I'll inject something and I'll bind it to a public property, and the injected thing is the active route. The activated route. The activated route, which is imported from @AngularRouter. So this router package gives us this activated route object, and this holds some important information about the route we're currently on. Now I want to use that information when the component is created, and it's a good practice to not do this in the constructor, to basically keep the constructor lean, but to instead use ng-on-init. So I will implement on-init here, make sure to also import that from @AngularCore, and therefore I'll then add my ng-on-init method, and in here we can now try to find out whether we have a post ID parameter or not. We can extract this by accessing this route, so our injected activated route, and there we have the param map object or property. Now the param map is actually a subscription, an observable, It's an observable to which we can subscribe. And as for all built-in observables, we never need to unsubscribe, by the way. Now it is an observable because the parameter in the URL could change whilst we're on the page. Because we could have some link which we can click to essentially load the same Angular component, but for a different post ID, let's say. So only the ID in the URL would change, the component is the same. But obviously, the data we display on that component would need to change too. And that is why we get this observable. With that, we can listen to changes in the route URL, or in the parameters to be precise, and we can therefore react to that and update our UI. But Angular avoids the unnecessary re-rendering of the entire component, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because it's still the same component. We just need to know about the change. So in that subscription here, we get a so-called param map object in our first callback here. So this will be executed whenever the parameters change. There we get our param map, which is of type param map. And now we can look into that param map and see if a certain parameter exists. So we can check if param map has the post ID parameter. Now why post ID? Because that is the identifier we defined in our app routing file. Here, post ID, this one. Because we have that name here, we have to look for that name here. If we have that post ID, we can try extracting it and using it. And if we don't have it, well, then we know we are in create mode. So we should probably store that information. I'll add a private property here, and I'll name this mode. And the mode by default, let's say, is create. Now we could set this here in our if check. There we could set mode equal to edit, because if we have a post ID, then we are in edit mode. And otherwise, else, we can set it to create. Of course, you could also use a number or an enum to control this. Now, with that, we also need to extract that post ID. So I will add another property here, post ID, which will be of type string, and initially it's undefined. Here, however, in the edit mode, I can set this post ID equal to param map get post ID, and this will be a string. Now in the create mode, I'll set it to null again, because here we have no post ID to edit. We are in create mode after all. So now we have that extra information. Now what else do we need to do? Well, we probably want to fetch the information about the post we're editing when we are editing it. And we can get it from our post service, of course. We could also get it from our backend, though. It depends. Do we want to get it from the post service, where we, of course, only have the latest snapshot? Or do we want to have a brand new version of it from our server? Now, we can go either way, but here, theoretically, we have no way of fetching an old version if we take it from the post service, so I will go with that approach right now. So therefore, we just need to be able to fetch a single post from our list of posts here, and for that I'll add a new method to the post service, get post, and there I'll expect to get the ID, which is a string, of the post I want to fetch. And then I simply return a new object here, because I want to create a clone of the object I'm returning. And I'll use the spread operator for this to pull out all the properties of an object and add them to a new object so that we again don't accidentally manipulate the original object in the array. And now I will just fetch that object from the posts array in the posts service with the help of the find method. There, a function will be executed on every post in the array, and if it returns true, then this is the post object it will return. So here I want to check if the post we're looking at, if that ID is equal to the ID we're passing as an argument here. So such a post would then be returned, then we would pull out all the properties and we would add them to a new JavaScript object, and that object is then returned. So now we have getPost. In post create, in that component, we already inject the post service. So now here we can just load that post. And we probably want to store that too. So here we can add a new private property post, which will be of type post. We will need to import that post type from our post model. So make sure to add this import path. And with that added, we can go down and here say this post is equal to this post service get post and pass on the post ID we just extracted from our URL. And now we're taking that post, we're storing it. Now the only thing that's left to do is that we actually fill our form with that post data and then handle the submission. Now, in order to see if that works, we just need to make sure that we can actually load this page. And for that, I'll go to my post list component, and here we have that added button. Now, that should actually not be a button, but instead it should be an anchor tag. And it should have a link, so with the help of router link again, which actually leads to /added, and then our dynamic parameters, so the ID of the post. Now for that we'll use a different syntax. We'll bind to a property of router link, which is also called router link, so we just wrap that with squared brackets. And now we don't pass a string here, but we pass squared brackets as a value, where we describe the individual segments of the path we want to load. And these segments are now strings. The first one is /added, because in the app routing configuration, we have /added as a first segment. But the next segment after the slash is actually post ID. So there in our post list, I will add a comma, a new element, and simply pass post.id, referring to the post we're looping through and then accessing the ID there. Now we're getting our post here, and now we just need to pre-populate our form with the values of that post. Now, since we're using the template-driven approach, this means that we have to do one-way binding on ng model here. Just using it to register this as a control isn't enough anymore. We need to give Angular the extra information of our default values you want to use. And this can be done by simply wrapping ng model with square brackets, and then we simply refer to the post, so that post property we have. That must not be private for that though, so let's remove that private decorator. This was an error. It should be a public property. So now we can access that post from within the template, and here I now access post.title like this. And the same for the content. I wrap it with square brackets and then access post.content. Now if we save this, let's try this out and let's see if we can visit this page and actually see an added form which holds our default values. For that, if I go back to the post list component, let's click that added button here. And if I do click it, we actually indeed see new post, and this is a new post. So this is working. It's pre-populated with our data, and we can still change that, of course. Now we just want to make sure that when we submit our post here, we actually do update it and not add it. For that, I'll go to my posts service, and here we don't really have a method for updating the post. We have one for adding and for deleting, but now it's time to add a new one, update post, And there I expect to get an ID of the post, which should get updated. And then let's say the post data. You could, of course, also again get a title and a new content, whatever you prefer. Let's go with the title and content again to be consistent with add post, I guess. Then again, I'll create a new post here that will be of type post. And it's a JavaScript object which has to have an ID, and that will be the ID we're getting here. It will also have a title, and that's the title we're getting as an argument, and a content, which is the content we have as an argument. Now we need a backend route to send this request to. So let's go back to our backend, to the app.js file. And here, maybe below the post route, but the position doesn't really matter, I'll add another route where I accept a different kind of HTTP request. And there are actually two HTTP requests you could take when it comes to updating content. You could handle put requests to put a new resource and completely replace the old one with it, or you take patch to only update a resource, an existing resource with new values. And it's up to you regarding how you want to handle this. Now I will accept a put request here, and I will accept a request which is reaching API/posts, but now important, I also want a dynamic segment here, and that will be ID. So the ID of the post which I want to replace, that is what I'm expecting here. With that, let's add our normal method, which we already know here on the backend. And now we just need to use Mongoose to update a resource. For that, let's use the post model again. And here we can actually use the update1 method. Now, update1, first of all, takes the a JavaScript object which narrows down which one to update. And here, this will simply be identified by an object which has an ID. Note, this is of course still _ID on the server, because in MongoDB our items have their ID stored in an _ID field. So where that ID is equal to request params ID. So this ID which is encoded in our URL, just as for deleting, where we also narrowed it down like this. Now, unlike deleting, we don't just pass one argument. The second argument is the new object we want to store. And that will be a new post, of course. So let's create a new post here with the new operator or new keyword. And that new post will receive a title, which we can get from the request body we're getting. Now, it's of course up to you regarding which data you expect there. I expect a body where I can extract a title and where I can extract a content. So really just as we're doing it for creating a new post here. Now we're getting that post data, and now it's this post which I want to save, so with which I want to update the existing one. Now let's chain then thereafter to handle the case that this was successful. And here in the callback where I get the result, I will, for one, print the result here to the console. And as a second step, I want to return a response. So send a response with the status code 200 and some JSON data where we could simply pass, for now, maybe pass a message where I say update successful. So now we got our backend route in place. Back to the front end then. It's reachable on this URL. So here in update post, I now want to use the local HTTP service, send a put request. Remember, because it's a put route, we're waiting for put requests here. So send such a put request to the same URL as for deleting, basically. So we can just copy that URL from down there. This is where we want to send our put request. Of course, we will have a payload here though. Put requests take a payload, the post which we want to use. And post ID is just ID here, like this. So now we're sending that put request. Now let's subscribe to that. We'll actually get back our response here. And for now, we can simply console log that response. That, of course, means we will not update the post locally yet, but let's just see if that works and how we would need to fix it if it doesn't. So with that, let's go back. One issue we can see is if I reload the page, then the content is gone, which makes sense because the post is not loaded into memory. So that is one argument for actually fetching the post whenever we go to that page. But for now, let's fix it by going back and then clicking on Edit here. And let's now add an extra exclamation mark and hit Save Post. And, well, not much is happening here. Now, why is that? Well, because we, of course, don't use update post. Instead, we just added a second one, right? This one, because we always add posts right now in the post create component. Here, we always add new posts. What we want to do here is, first of all, we maybe want to name this on save post because it's actually now more about saving, not just about adding. So in the template, we also connected here with on save post on the submit event. And then here in on save post, we check the mode. And if this mode is equal to create, well, then we will still, of course, add a post like this. Else, we want to call this post service update post and send our post ID as well as our title and content. And we get that, of course, well, in exactly the same way as we did here. So we simply pass on foreign value title and foreign value content. Now we're calling update post, and now if we save this, go back, edit this post, and add a third exclamation mark and hit save post, we get an error here. Method put is not allowed, so that's a course error. Let's go back to app.js. And indeed, we're allowing a patch request, but not a put request. So let's add put here to the allowed course headers on the backend in app.js. Save that and try again. Back to messages, edit, add that third exclamation mark, clear the console maybe, and hit save. And now we don't know, right? Let's go to the server-side log. And there doesn't look too good. Looks like we got an error. Performing an update on the path ID would modify the immutable field ID. So the problem we actually have here is that on the backend, we tried to update the existing post with the new post, but since I created the post like this, it actually would create a new ID too. And that's not allowed. We can't replace that ID because that ID is not, we can't override this for an existing resource. Now we could, of course, delete the old post and add a new one. We can also try setting the ID here to the ID of the post we're receiving, because that post, that incoming body will have an ID because we're sending the post with that ID. So let's give that a try. Let's go back and reload. Add it again, add that third exclamation mark, save. And now this looks better because now we're not trying to generate a new ID. Instead, on the backend, we're now reusing the existing ID. And the update process recognizes this, and therefore it's all right. So now we updated the post, and we can finally see this if we go back and reload that page. Here we see new post with 3 exclamation marks. And deleting also still works. So that's all working, that's all fine. 2 things are missing though. For one, I want to instantly update this in the local array, even though we always fetch a new version when we go back to that page. But I want to update it immediately once we're done with the updating. And I also want to make sure that if we are on that updating page and we reload, we actually load that post again, because the ID is still part of the URL. So we got everything we need, and therefore we should implement this feature. We're able to update the post. I will no longer console log that on the server. But what I want to do is, we are returning the message that we were successful, right? And on the front end in the post service, where we sent that HTTP request, there we got all the data we need to update the post on the front end too. Now, as I said, this is kind of redundant here, because the only place where we use the posts is the messages the root page, and there we always fetch a new copy anyways. But I still want to show you how you can locally update the posts once you got that success response here. Now we could do this by, taking the post we got there anyways, and simply replacing the current version of that post in our posts array with that version. For that, I'll first of all clone our post array and store it in an updated posts constant. There I'll store this posts. Then I'll search for that old post version by its ID. So I'll search for the index. Old post index will be updated posts. Find index. Find index takes a function that will return or should return true if we found the post we're looking for. So here I'm checking whether the post or the ID of the post I'm looking at in that array, if that is equal to the post ID, so of the ID of the post we updated. If it's equal, then I found the index of the post I want to replace. So then I can say updated posts for that old post index, replace that with my new post here, so with this post. Once all of that is done, I can say this posts equals updated posts. And now we get an immutable way of updating the old posts. Now I just need to tell my app about it by sending this, this event through the subject again. And here I send a copy of my updated posts with it. So now we're doing this locally, even though, again, it's not that important in our current setup, but I still want to do it like that. Now, as a next step, I also want to make sure that if we are on the edit page and we reload, we don't have that blank form again because we failed to fetch the post. And we do fail because if we reload, all our state is lost, the app restarts, and therefore our posts array in the service will be empty because we only fetch posts from the server with get posts, which is only called in the post list component. But if we reload on this page, we will not have visited this component yet. So therefore, we also need to get that single post data from the server on this page. And we can do this by, adding a new method. We actually have a method already, getPost. And we can recycle that to not get the post from our local array of posts, but instead to get it from the server. So let's go back to our app.js file, or our server-side code, and let's actually add a new route there. App, and then it'll be a get request, so let's use the get method, and it'll be a get request to API posts for a given ID. So again, a dynamic parameter to fetch a post with that ID. Then we have the method we already know and love. And in here, I want to reach out to my database and find a post with that ID. And it's actually super easy to find that. We can use the post model for that. And there we have a find by ID method. And as the name suggests, we simply pass an ID as an argument here, and Mongoose will have a look at our database and find an element with that ID in there. So we just pass request params ID here to refer to that encoded ID from our URL. And then we add the then block where we will get an argument, our post, which we fetched. And in here, we first of all should check if post exists. If it does not exist, then I want to return a response with a status code of 404 and a JSON document where we might have a message like post not found because we failed to find a post for that ID. But otherwise, I will return a response with a 200 code where we actually also return JSON data, and that JSON data could simply be our post or another object with a property post where you then store this. So now we're returning the post here from the database. We just need to call that from our client now. And we do that here. Now we will have one problem though. Right now, getPost returns a post. Well, it'll not be able to do that anymore because if we make a HTTP call here, that'll be asynchronous code and you can't return inside of a subscription. You need to return synchronously. So that means you can't return in a place which will run some time in the future. So what I'll do here instead is I will still return something, but I will return the observable we're getting from the Angular HTTP client so that we can subscribe in the component where we are interested in that data. So here I will then return this HTTP get and send a GET request to that same URL we used here for updating the post with that ID, which we're getting as an argument here too. So send that GET request there and return the result of this GET request, which is our observable. Now we won't subscribe here. Instead, we'll now subscribe in the post create component. There, we won't assign this post like this, but instead here, we can now set up a subscription, which we also don't need to unsubscribe from because it's added by the Angular HTTP client. Therefore, Angular takes care about it. And here we know that eventually we'll get our post data. And therefore here we can set this post equal to, and now that's important, to a new JavaScript object where we set the ID equal to post data underscore ID, because remember, this is data coming from the database, and there it's stored in an underscore ID thing. And then also the title equal to post data title, and the content equal to post data content. And now I get all these red squiggly lines because I forgot one thing in the post service. We can be explicit about the type of data we get back. Here, get is a generic method, and we can let TypeScript know that we get back an object which will have an ID property that is a string, or which will have a title which is a string, or that will have a content which is a string, like this. Now this will work in post create too. Now we initialize the post like this. Let's give this a try. Let's save that. Back on the page, if I reload, it seems to work, but we also get an error that we can't read property title of undefined. And the reason for this is eventually we will have the post data, but not right from the start, because this HTTP request takes some time to be executed. However, post initially is undefined, and we try to read a value from it here with the ng model right from the start. This can be fixed by using the so-called Elvis operator. In the template, add a question mark after post, and this will force Angular to check whether a post exists before it tries to read the title. And it will populate this field with nothing if the post does not exist. And the same down there for the content. With this, if you save that, the page will reload and we don't see an error. And now if I add a lot of exclamation marks here and I hit save and I go back, we see this is our post here. So now this is working. One important note though, our updating mechanism here in update post in the post service, where we replace the old post with that ID, well, that will actually not work. It'll just do nothing here because, of course, if we never visited our post list page, well, then we won't have any posts in that array, so there is nothing to update. So it will not fail. We load the updated list anyways when we visit that page. It's just something for you to keep in mind. So with that, we're now able to edit posts too. Updating and fetching posts, that's all working, and that's great. And we're making good progress. Sure, authentication is missing, and I also want to add an image upload soon. But there's one thing I want to do in this module still before we move on to such features. And that is our backend. Right now we're organizing everything in app.js. And this is okay, it's still no super big file, but I actually want to organize my routes here differently, because we'll later add more routes for authentication and so on, and I really want to group them. So just as we have a folder and file structure on the front end, I want to have one on the back end. So besides our models folder, which we're using for the post model right now, I'll add another folder, and I'll name it routes. And there I want to organize the routes for our backend. I'll add a new subfolder and name it post.js in the routes folder now. Excuse me, posts.js actually, because it's for all our posts. Now in there, I want to add all my posts routes. And I will actually use another feature provided by Express, its own router. For that, I'll first of all import Express here with require Express in that new post.js file. And then I'll set up the Express router by creating a new constant, which I'll name router. The name is up to you, as always, where I will simply execute Express and there the router constructor. So now I got my router here, and now I just want to define my routes, and just as we did it with app in app.js here, app post, app get, we can now use router get and so on here. And it essentially works in exactly the same way as it did before. So now here we can, for example, replicate this post route by grabbing its URL, make this a post route here, pass the URL as the first argument, and then this function here as a second argument. And therefore, we can, of course, simply grab all these routes here, cut them from the app.js file, and add them here, and simply replace app with router. Alternatively, name this app, but I want to stick to router to make this really clear that it's an extra feature. Now I'll simply select all apps here and replace them with router, and we're pretty good to go. Now we need to export this router to make Express aware of it, or to be able to make it aware of it. For that, I'll use the node export syntax with module exports and simply export the entire router object. Now with that, we need to import it into app.js so that we can again make our main Express app aware of these extra routes, because right now all our routes would fail. So back in the app.js file, I will import something here, maybe above the post model. Oh, by the way, the post model, I need to import that in my route file here in the post file now, because that is where I use that post model. So let's go to the top there and actually import post here. The path changed. Now we need to go up one level because we're in the routes folder and then into the models folder. So now we have the post model imported into the routes file. We don't need it in the app.js file. Here we're never accessing it. And now I can import my posts routes by simply requiring /routes posts. So now this router object is imported and stored in this posts routes constant here. And now to make Express aware of it, I can simply call app use posts routes, and this will do the trick. We can fine-tune this, however. Actually, later we'll have multiple routes files, and this one should only handle routes which reach API posts /nothing or /something like that ID. So I want to cut that part here and assume that any route or any request reaching that file already was filtered for that, so that I can then add this here in app.js as a first argument of app use. Here, I will filter for requests going to API posts, and only requests where the URL or the path of the URL starts with that will be forwarded into the posts routes file and routing setup. And then in here, we don't have to check for this again because it will already have been filtered for that. And it will also be stripped of that, by the way. So the path we're looking at here will actually be the path after whatever we added here. And therefore now, here we have our post request. We now also remove it for the put request. We leave the ID here though, because that's some extra addition to the path, which is important here. For the get request, we remove it all. For the posts request down there, we just leave the ID. Here, we remove that. And now we got a path set up. Let's add the / again, where we should still have a working app as before. And we can test this by, for example, deleting this. Seems to work. Also, if I reload, where we can add a new post again. So let's also try this. And where we now just have a nicer setup on the backend.